Bingo. There we are. Right, so lecture 2. This is the lecture 2. This is the other thermoregulatory lecture. What I want to concentrate on is the responses to cold and to heat. And some of this will be a little bit of repetition of what we've done before, no harm in that. And then we'll look at extremes, what happens when these things go out of control. These are examples of pathophysiology which illustrate the mechanisms. And it will descend, if that's the right word, down into first aid, more or less. First aid. Can I just ask for a little show of hands? Nothing embarrassing, I promise you. Have we got anybody who has a serious interest in mountain climbing, or anything of that kind? Serious hill walking, mountaineers? No. Have we got anybody who runs serious distances, so half marathons, marathons? No? You're all too busy studying. Okay, very good. That's how you got here, I suppose. You didn't get here by running fast. Okay. That makes me the expert in that case, because those people know things, and they would have been able to tell me things. Okay, so we'll look at some of those things there. We won't spend much time on that, because we've done quite a lot of that, and we'll do a little bit of regulation, and mostly on the extremes. So that's kind of simple stuff. This will have a relatively low density of information, for which you will be grateful. You're grateful, good. Okay, so we'll enjoy ourselves a little bit around that. So the learning outcome that I've devised for this is a fairly general kind of statement. It's not broken down into specifics. So explain the changes in thermoregulation extreme states and the principles of their management. So we'll do that. Okay, now, a little equation. This slide actually slipped out of last time's lecture. This is the one I skipped last time. It's actually incredibly important. Notice I haven't put any writing on, and I'm not going to. This is straight out of Sherwood's book. This is the energy balance equation. Now, it's very fundamental. It has to do with energy inputs and outputs and energy storage in the body. And since we're now terribly fixated, in the West at least, with body weight, then, I dare say people not in the West are fixated with body weight, but they have rather different problems. But this illustrates some of the equations. So here is your energy input to the body. We're ignoring solar radiation for the most part, since in these islands it's insignificant. So food energy, that contributes to the metabolic pool in the body, and that in turn contributes to energy storage. You can use energy in a variety of different ways. You can use it for internal work, essentially metabolism and whatever you're doing there, and for external work, moving things about in the environment, right, as opposed to moving things about inside you. And a product of that, as we've seen, particularly in relation to muscle and indeed metabolism, is that you generate heat. So we are nice, warm, little furry persons. There we are. Thermal energy as heat. Or you can use external work, and that will generate a little bit of heat as well. Now, the Fick principle in physiology, you've probably heard about the Fick principle when you've been doing cardiovascular things, applies to this just as much as anything else, and applies to the gut. Essentially, what goes in and doesn't come out is stored in the case of energy, right? So if you eat more, you take in more energy than you use, then you will build up your energy store. In other words, you get fat, because that's where you store energy. So you store energy mostly in the form of adipose tissue, the long-term stores, the short-term stores in the form of glycogen. So that equation, energy in, energy out, plus stores. So it's immutable. So if you want to lose weight, if you're like me and you need to lose an eyebrow or two, an eyelash or two, then the only way to do it is to decrease intake and or increase output. There are no cheats. There are no cheats. You can't do anything else other than odd pathological things such as uncoupling proteins and things like that. So that's immutable. There's an area, quite a complex area of study, and you'll find lots of studies that show that actually it's very difficult to increase, apparently very difficult to simply increase your workload and decrease to achieve weight loss or changes in body shape. But it's a very difficult area, and there are more variables than you can shake a stick at. So I wouldn't believe that too much. We've talked about that in other places. Oh, little border there that shouldn't be there. Right. This slide was in the last lecture, and I just want to remind you of it so that you got this model, as it were, fixed in your mind. Again, we're talking about body temperature, and bearing in mind there is a set point. We've discussed briefly how that might be altered in fever. External temperature, body temperature as the regulated variable. There are thermoreceptors, which are there in the CNS. They measure the temperature of arterial blood, essentially. And you've got peripheral receptors in the skin. Input to the integrating centre there, classical feedback model. Various outputs to the various effectors, skeletal muscles. If temperature drops, you may precipitate shivering, and leads to lots of heat generation, and your classic negative feedback loop. Blood vessels in the skin constrict or alter their vasomotor tone to allow increased blood flow or decreased blood flow. Here the body temperature is dropping, so we want to decrease blood flow, and thence heat loss. Heat loss falls, body temperature rises. There, back again. Sweat glands, you decrease sweat production, doesn't stop, you decrease sweat production, and heat loss is thereby decreased again. So that's the basic mechanism. There's long-term regulatory things. You can up your metabolism a little bit, but it's not a significant one. So set points we know about. So here's the physiological response to cold. Straight lift from Sherwood, your very own favourite textbook. And I've just done a straight copy and paste, as it were, from this, including the mildly eccentric spelling. Sorry, North Americans. You can't help it. In response to cold exposure, hypothalamic, yes, we know it's hypothalamic. If you're cold, then you've got to increase heat production and you've got to decrease heat loss. So you attack both sides of the equation. Heat loss, heat production, input, output. Change them both. We should come back to a model very like that when we look at blood glucose, for example, input and output. So keep that in mind. No good doing one without doing the other, or it's better to do them both. So ways of increasing heat production: increase muscle tone, shiver if necessary, increase voluntary exercise, so cabman's buff, swing your arms about and stride about. That's called the cabman's buff. Did you know that? No, you didn't. Put money on that. It's called the cabman's buff. It's a way of generating heat. It's very Dickensian. You've heard of Dickens, yeah? Oh, good. Otherwise I'm in the wrong place, I think. Non-shivering thermogenesis. There's metabolic ways of doing that. Brown fat, if you've got it, and we don't have very much. That's a little star there to indicate behavioural adaptations, because we are quite sophisticated, but we're not unique like this. Other animals can adapt their behaviour. One of the ways of adapting to cold exposure, and the easiest way, is to get out of the cold, and that's what we do most of the time. Or we put more clothes on, or indeed some clothes on, as the case may be. So that's a behavioural adaptation. So you can do that. Decreasing heat loss. Oops. I'm very heavy-handed, so I pick up the mouse and drop it, and it does that. Skin vasoconstriction, yes, of course. That's how you control most of the heat loss. So vasoconstriction in the skin, reduced blood flow, reduced radiation. Postural changes, hunching of the shoulders and the area. In fact, I was looking at a little paper yesterday about how to conserve your body temperature while immersed in water. I thought, will I give you those pictures and talk about that? And I thought, no, they don't deserve it. One of the ways of doing that, if you are immersed in water which is cooler than you are, which is most water in the world, one of the ways of prolonging your survival is to hunch up, to bring your arms in close to your body and bring your legs up as far as you can. So you reduce your surface area. Now you can only do this if you've got what they call a personal flotation device. Do not try this in the swimming pool without a personal flotation device. You will drown. At least you may drown. And you're too expensive to lose. Right. Postural changes, so you can reduce that. So hunching the shoulders, doing that, you see people do it. And pull clothes across them and so on. So you see all that hunching and increased muscle tone, put on the clothing. So that's heat loss. Okay. Now, this is a fairly complicated slide. Much more complicated than it will appear when you print it. Physiologically, we recognise 3 grades of hypothermia, that is to say, falling body temperature. We recognise mild, moderate and severe. And I've distinguished between them, but actually the distinctions between mild and moderate are not very important. The big difference is severe and the other two, as you'll see. So if you're mild to moderate, and this is your core temperature, remember, is around here. Normal core temperature about 38. If it drops down to about 32, or it drops down to about even as low as 25, that's a huge drop. I wouldn't like my body temperature down there, thank you very much. You'll be shivering. You'll be shivering a lot. Knees knocking, teeth rattling, everything. You'll be more or less conscious. How can you tell? I know, yeah. Able to answer simple questions, you know, who am I, where am I, what's the point of the universe, things like that. Impaired motor skills, but not grossly impaired motor skills. So while not possibly able to write your name, you will be able to hold a mug of tea or some other liquid, or not whiskey. If you're in this state, that's not what you want. It will kill you. So slightly impaired motor skills. Consciousness, okay, possibly a bit dopey, but otherwise all right. Compare that with severe hypothermia, when your body temperature is dropped below 25. This is seriously low. There is no shivering. Shivering has stopped. You've got brain is shutting down at this point. Seriously impaired consciousness, confused, not sure about life, the universe and everything, not sure about what they were doing, not sure about anything. And motor skills are limited, gross movements at best. So not able to pick anything up, not able to move it in a productive kind of way, maybe just about able to twitch helpfully, but not much else. This is a very ill person. Hypothermia is dangerous. So the first things you do, I'll do them one at a time, but you'll see there are not much differences in the middle. You must protect the person. The first thing to do is to get them out of the cold, or protect them from the cold as much as you can. Get them some kind of shelter, get them out of the wind if there is any, because that will increase heat loss by convection and radiation. Insulate effectively, get something underneath the person if you can do it, and insulate them as much as you can. Get those survival blankets on that reflect heat back in and all the rest of it. Protect them from the wind. Must keep them dry, because water conducts heat very effectively, as you will know if you get any steam on your person. You can warm the person. It is safe to do so. If they're in this state, you can apply gentle heat. So gentle rubbing, or you can apply a bit of radiation heat, get a bit of a fire or a heated fan heater or something like that. You may give warm drinks. Glucose is a good thing to give because it's a fuel and they'll use it to generate heat, so that's good. And you can move them about. You can rub them around and gently flex and unflex arms. If they can move, let them move. That's okay. As you'll see, in severe hypothermia, if you get them to move, you will kill them. You might like to think about why that might be. The outcome in mild hypothermia is that you will make a full recovery. You'll probably never forget the experience, but you'll survive, at least physically. For moderate, it's much the same. You can warm the person gently up. You do just the same, protect them in the same way, warm them up, but you don't exercise the person because the blood temperature is lower. And you don't want to exercise, you don't want to move the blood around quickly, you want to warm it up first. But you can apply gentle heat to the person. And the best places to apply heat in somebody who is fairly well shot is the neck and the axillae, the groin and armpit areas, because there's superficial blood vessels there, and they will warm up fairly nicely and fairly gently. So that's that one. Outcome, if you're moderately hypothermic, you'll probably recover. You may recover, but there may be long-term effects. You've got so chilled you may have seriously anoxic lumps of brain or anything else, so you may have long-term effects, bits of finger falling off, noses and such like things. Frostbite, in other words, dead tissue. Now, in severe, remember you've got a very confused, fixed patient, no shivering going on. Do not move the patient, or the victim, as they say in these little sites. They talk about the victim. I'll give you some URLs. The URLs sitting at the top if you want to have a look, follow those up. If this sort of thing does it for you, have a look. There's some pictures in some of them. Don't move them because there is cold blood out in the extremities. So if you move the person at all vigorously, and you've got to be really careful even getting them onto a stretcher. If you move them at all vigorously, you may shift a reasonably large volume of cold blood from the periphery to the core. And what's that going to do? It's going to give you a belt of cold blood into the brain. So it's quite likely to be fatal. And it will also give cold blood into the heart. Might also be fatal. So those are serious shock. So even in warming of a less severely hypothermic victim, if you like, or can we call them survivors? No, actually. You've got to be careful because there's a phenomenon known as after drop. That the core temperature, once you've started to revive them, the core temperature may drop because of this shift of cold blood from the periphery. So it's something you have to be very careful about. So you cannot move this kind of subject. You can get them onto a litter, but don't try and stand them up or shake them about or rub them, any of that. A little bit of gentle spooning. Do you know what spooning is? You do know what spooning is. Not Valentine's Day spooning, that's a different kind of spooning. This is spooning. It's where you take your clothes off and you fold yourselves round one another. In a cold environment, this is a major survival skill. If I didn't hate the cold so much, it could be fun. But anyway, it's a survival skill. So I don't know quite why it's necessary to remove all your clothes. It should be just as effective with your clothes on. Less effective if you put a telephone directory between you. That's a reference to a very old story, won't go there. Right. So stabilise temperature. Don't warm. You've just got to allow the temperature to come up very slowly. So you protect, wrap up, and attempt to warm very slowly. Do not attempt to give fluids, even though the subject will probably be dehydrated, and very gentle warming by spooning or its equivalent. I'm not sure what its equivalent is. Forking, possibly. Outcome, not dead until warm and dead. That's what they say in the trade. So when you find somebody who looks as though they've gone, severely hypothermic, halfway up a mountain where they shouldn't have been in the first place, you do not make a diagnosis of dead until you've got them warm and there are no other vital signs. So that's so this is mountain rescue stuff. It's pretty scary. So anyway, if you like that sort of stuff, as you might, if you can read that, it says something or other, search dog. So this is mountain rescue stuff or extreme environment stuff. These are people, and these are notes. What are they called? First aid for hypothermia. It's simple stuff, but it's quite a nice little account of the things, and it's very, very practical. This is the sort of thing that these mountain rescue people have up their jumper. So that's what they rescue. So your diagnosis, if confronted with somebody like that, is it mild, is it severe, or is it moderate? If it's severe, you're in a whole different ballgame. You've got to be extremely careful, and they're going to need full hospital support. Intensive care support probably. In response to heat, exactly the reciprocal of what we had in the previous table, of course. If you want to reduce heat, you've got to decrease heat production. You're too hot, produce less heat, and increase heat loss. So decrease the muscle tone, relax. Relax. If you ever notice, if you compare how people walk here, in general, with how people walk in hot countries, I'm sure many of you will have been to hot countries. I remember my first visit to the West Indies, I couldn't believe how slowly people moved. Absolutely staggering. And you watch it, I mean, even, it's ingrained practice. If it's a hot country, you move slowly. Physical work takes much longer in the heat. It takes forever. I remember watching the gardeners in these touristy hotels. They sweep a leaf and a half. I can't do it that slowly. Slower than that. You can't do a day's work at the speed at which we do it. It's just not possible. So they're very highly adapted to this low, slow way. So I like to practice my West Indian walk sometimes, but I'm still not very good at it. Not enough practice. It needs to be a lot warmer than it is here most of the time before you can do that. So decreased muscle tone, decreased voluntary exercise. So go nice and slow. Increased heat loss, skin vasodilatation, go all nice and pink, radiate lots of heat, and you'll be all pink. I must say, pink and sweating I find terribly attractive somehow. There you go. And so that's what you do. Vasodilate, sweat, reduce that. Don't mop, sweat. physiologically very good. And adopt cool clothing, which tends to be loose coveralls, rather than doing what the Brits do abroad. They take everything off and wander around with their little red legs all over the place, looking pretty disgusting. What you really need is high protection, long-sleeved and long trousers, which is fairly loose, so it allows a bit of air movement. Stripping off and going pink and nasty is really not the best thing to do. It appears to be nice, but there you go. So here's hypothermia. This bloke is hyperthermic, it says here. He's a cross-country cyclist. He's a serious cyclist, and he's mildly overdone it. One of the easiest ways of becoming hyperthermic is to exercise in high ambient temperature, what they call exertional hyperthermia. Notice you have to emphasize that second syllable to distinguish between hypothermia and hyperthermia, something that newsreaders don't do. So he's hyperthermic. He's generated a lot of heat in high ambient conditions, and somebody's very kindly pouring water all over him. That will make him feel better. No, and it will cool him down a bit by the physical contact of the water, but it will evaporate eventually, and he will cool. You need to increase evaporation in somebody like that to get that right. So hypothermia is a temperature above the normal range, and it may be unrelated to infection. If it's got an infection, then it's probably a fever rather than hyperthermia. So you can have exercise-induced, which is one thing, exertional, and you can have non-exertional. And really, non-exertional can occur. The elderly is the classic case, not in these islands, but think of New York in the summer, where it goes very hot, and there's a case history, which I think is not flagged on there in the URL. Typical thing, an elderly person is found unconscious or very nearly unconscious in the middle of a sweltering summer, and the air conditioning has failed, and so on and so forth. The elderly are not very resistant to this, do not have good body temperature regulatory mechanisms, do not have good control over their environment. They're a bit gaga. Worse than I am, that is. So they don't control their environment. The very young also don't have good control of their environment. They're not very good at moving from a hot place to a cold place or a cool place. They're not very good at regulating their environment. They don't have control. They don't have very good thermoregulatory mechanisms. So you may get hyperthermia. We'll see what you do. I've just thrown fever on there because it's another kind of hyperthermia. We talked about that yesterday. And we know that that's caused by resetting of the hypothalamic control center by pyrogens from white blood cells. Okay, so I'll just repeat it there so you don't lose it. So here's work in a hot environment. This information, incidentally, vast amounts of it was found by studying the armed forces, the militia. Because in the armed forces, in the good old days, you could say to fellows, go into that hot place there and run up and down for a bit, my good man. And they said, yes, sir, and did it. Nowadays they sue, and possibly for the better. So there you are. But you could do all these experiments. So there were huge numbers of these things were done in military environments. So there are lots of experiments, because you can do whatever you like to those. Now you will have had some... Oh, that's interesting. Oh. Sorry about that. Got my custom animation the wrong way around. There we are. All right. You will have had some information, I think, from Stuart Warmington about the competing demands for blood in exercise between skin and muscle. Yes? Nod. You did. Yeah. They always say no. I'm not going to do it again for you anyway, because that's his bit. Heat exhaustion. Right. There are a number of conditions. We distinguish between heat exhaustion and heat stroke. One is much worse than the other. In heat exhaustion, you're sweating. You're generating lots and lots of sweat. You can sweat up to about 2 litres an hour, I think. You will die if you do that. Not at the rate of, but if you secrete 2 litres, you will die, because you can't replace it fast enough. So you will be sweating prodigiously in a hot environment while you're working, and that will lead to a reduction in blood volume. You know what a reduction in blood volume does, because Stuart told you. Was it Stuart? Yes. Yeah, was. Good. If it was Dr. Kelly, you'd know, because she's little and he's big, She's dark, he's fair. Right. And one of them is Australian. Right, and you'd notice. So excessive sweating, reduced blood volume, so that tends to lead to a fall in blood weight. Redistributed blood flow, because you've got to distribute blood flow to the skin dramatically to get the temperature down. This is a crisis, body temperature is rising. So this will lead to a fall in blood pressure, and then you will feel weak and dizzy, and you may fall down in a little heap. Right? This will release some of the demand for maintaining blood pressure, of course, because if you're lying down, you don't have as much pumping to do to get things to the important bits. So blood pressure will fall. So that's the key element, competing demands for the blood for cooling. So for treatment, you've got to replace the fluid. You can give cooled fluids because it's not going to stress them unduly. Give cool fluid, and you may, if it was an emergency and you're in the right place, you may infuse it. That's to say, set up an IV drip and whack in a litre or two of cool saline or something like it. And rest, because they're exhausted. And they need to just rest and recover and wait for all that body fluid to come back right and get everything else right. So that's pretty easy. You're sweating, thermoregulatory mechanisms are working, and eventually they fail to compensate. Body fluid is compromised, blood volume is compromised, down you go. Preferably you sit down before you fall down. However, in heat stroke, it's more pathological still, because you get to the point where you can't compensate anymore. So the system starts to shut down. So you now have a high body temperature, high core temperature, and the thermoregulatory mechanisms are not working anymore because it's got so high that you're not working. So it's uncompensated. So you get CNS malfunction. You get stupid. You're not sure what things are. You may become unconscious. Thermoregulatory center, TRC, thermoregulatory center in the hypothalamus fails. It's a CNS malfunction, right? It's a hypothalamus. So sweating stops, and the metabolic rate goes up out of control. So now you have a vicious cycle. You're not able to cool yourself because you can't sweat anymore, and your metabolism is now out of control and is generating more heat. This is life-threatening. In fact, what do they say? 80% of heat stroke patients will die. So it's serious. It's a very serious condition. If you do the right thing, you can save about 10% of them. So it's serious. You've got to get the core temperature down. So you've got to use ice packs, axilla and the throat, anywhere else. If you can do it, and I don't practice this at home, lavage. You know what lavage is? Well, you can wash the outside of the body, that's all right, with cool water and radiation, get increasing airflow, all of those things over the body. In serious cases, in operating theatres, when you get a case called malignant malignant hyperthermia, which I'll talk about in a moment. There, you can lavage by opening the abdominal cavity and whacking in a few ice packs. This is very effective at bringing body temperature down. Ruins your bikini line, but it might keep you alive. And increase evaporation, so get the fans going, get a bit of wafting going, open the doors, windows, whatever you can do. Obviously get the person out of the heat. So there we are. Now here's malignant hypothermia, which we should do in about 5 minutes. This is a picture of a pig, a supine pig. Right? In the top picture, this is a perfectly normal posture for a supine pig. Pigs aren't very often supine, but if you're going to do operations on them, surgery on them, that's what you do. You put them on their backs and you can intubate and do all and get lines in and all the rest. So its little legs, its little chubby pink legs, are all nice and floppy. Right, there they are, all nice and floppy. But if you get malignant hyperthermia, which is a sensitivity to a particular anaesthetic, halothane is an anaesthetic. Routine clinical use, may not be now, because I don't go there anymore, but it was a routine anaesthetic. And it precipitates a failure of smooth reticulum calcium reuptake in muscle. So if you go back over your muscle physiology, then you will work out that that leads to muscle contraction, prolonged muscle contraction. Without the calcium reuptake, the muscles cannot relax. So you get rigor, or rigor if you prefer, and there it is, there are these little rigorous legs. They've gone rigid. Now I've actually seen this done. It's very dramatic. It's absolutely spectacular to see, because one of my former colleagues used to work on malignant hypothermia. It's very important. It's of commercial importance in pigs because they can go into a condition like this if they get stressed. And because the muscle is contracted extremely like that, it diminishes the quality of the meat and it's no longer saleable. So it was commercially important. And he was a veterinary physiologist, and he was working on these pigs, vast amounts of money, loads of pigs. So he was doing this. And you see the little legs go, and they're completely rigid. You can't move the muscle at all. You can't press a thumb into it. It's like a piece of wood, just like this stuff. Absolutely spectacular. So you've got hypermetabolism. The muscle is contracted, the metabolism is shot up, leads to all sorts of other conditions called acidosis, which you might have talked about with Stuart, because it's hypermetabolism, so that's what destroys the meat. So it's a spectacular effect. Now, we have it occurs in humans. It's very rare, it's familial, and they test for it. If somebody has it, then they test all the other members of the family. That must be very comforting to the late dear departed. If they are dear departed, they can, as I say, be survived. So here we are. Here's a little cartoonette of one of these people. And this person is seriously hyperthermic. Temperatures shot up 40 degrees and rising. Still going up. So you've got to do this down. You've got to do cooling. You've got to inhibit the muscle. So you whack in something which will inhibit the contraction of the muscle. And there's a nice little reference for you, so you can go and look at that too. Lavage, whack in lots of ice wherever you can put it. Just try not to burn the gut with it. And treat the acidosis. So you're going to infuse alkali solution. Yes, ma'am?
What causes the hypometabolism?
It's the same kind of effect. It's the same as it's halothane response. It's a super response to halothane. So this occurs in the operating theatre. So this is dramatic, folks. So if you like fun, that's the place to go. You get somebody in there and you're just giving a routine anaesthetic. Now, they've probably abolished halothane by now. But giving a routine anaesthetic, all of a sudden body temperature starts to rise and you get this rigidity. Now, you've got to act fast. You've got to start cooling. Suspend the operation, get on with the cooling. And treat the acidosis. So you've got to bang in some buffers. Thank you for the questions very much. I managed to hear it too, which is good for me. So if you get patients who have that or a crisis like that, then you screen, they nip out a bit of muscle, and they have a halothane or caffeine test for the muscle in vitro, in the test tube, so to speak, and that demonstrates the tendency to malignant hyperthermia. So you just tattoo on their forehead or something, no halothane in any circumstances. Or yeah, the usual sort of thing. Okie dokie. There you are. I said you get out early. You can go and buy all the sandwiches now. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.